Her name is spoken softly in myth, a figure painted as a maiden, a victim, a girl stolen by darkness. Yet beneath the surface lies another truth, a truth forged in the quiet turning of seasons, a truth shaped in the halls of a kingdom no mortal has ever returned from. Persephone was never simply taken. Persephone was never merely lost. Persephone became the axis upon which the ancient world turned. A goddess who rose from innocence to sovereignty. A queen who walked into shadow and rebuilt it with her own hands. A power born not from violence, but from transformation. The myth begins with spring, but it ends with the creation of balance itself. Before she was Persephone, she was Kore. Kore meant the maiden. Not for her youth, but for what she represented. Untouched potential, divine renewal, the breath of spring before the world wakes. Her world was one of gentle mornings, blooming meadows, and an existence carved by her mother's protection. Demeter, the goddess of harvest, shaped every corner of her daughter's life. Every field that blossomed, every grain that ripened, every flower that rose beneath Kore's hands. The mother guarded the daughter, and the daughter embodied the mother's purpose. Yet even in Olympus, power carries a shadow, and the gods do not allow anything perfect to remain hidden forever. Kore lived under a singular truth. Nothing in her life was unscripted. The nymphs who surrounded her were chosen. The landscapes she walked were blessed. The seasons themselves bent around her presence. Demeter's vigilance was not simple affection. It was fear. A fear born from prophecy. A fear born from the knowledge that the most fertile forces in the world are often the most desired. A fear that if Kore ever slipped beyond her mother's sight, the world itself might shift. So Kore grew without Olympus politics, without suitors, without dangers known to gods and mortals alike. But destiny has a way of finding those it seeks, and Kore's destiny was already watching from below. Every origin of transformation begins with a single, unremarkable moment. For Kore, it was the morning she wandered beyond the boundary Demeter considered safe. She entered a meadow where the air felt unnaturally still, a meadow untouched by nymphs, uncoloured by the usual sway of spring. In its centre stood a flower unlike any she had seen, a blossom crafted with impossible symmetry, a bloom too flawless to be natural. The ancient texts say it was placed by Gaia. Others say it was planted by Zeus. Some argue it was an omen from fate itself. Kore reached down. The petals shimmered, and the ground beneath her opened in silence. No quake, no thunder, no chaos. Just a precise, calculated opening, as if the world had been waiting for this exact movement. From the darkness rose a chariot forged of shadow and gold, drawn by horses whose hooves struck sparks of silence, and at its helm stood Hades, the god the world misunderstood before it even learned his name, the ruler of a realm no light could touch, the keeper of justice, order, and the delicate line between existence and its end. He did not rise in violence, he did not seize in frenzy, he emerged with purpose. His gaze did not regard Kore as a prize, it regarded her as an answer. For the underworld had no queen, and balance demanded one. The myths often speak of abduction, but the oldest versions describe something different. A moment of hesitation, a moment of recognition, a moment where Kore understood that the meadow was no longer her horizon. The chariot surged downward, the earth closed above her, and the world of the living held its breath. The descent was not a plunge into chaos. It was an arrival into order, a realm built on law, structure, and inevitability. The underworld was not a prison. It was a kingdom waiting for its missing half. When Demeter turned and found the meadow empty, the earth responded instantly. The winds paused, the grasses stilled, the world exhaled in dread. Demeter searched with a desperation that reshaped nations, disguised among mortals, wandering across continents, demanding answers from gods who feared her fury. This was not merely a mother's anguish. This was the collapse of the world's stability. Demeter's sorrow spread across the land. Crops failed, rivers dried, mortals starved. The gods depend on mortal worship, and if the mortals died, Olympus would fall with them. Demeter withheld her gifts not to punish, but because the world could not bloom without core. The seasons froze, the soil slept. The world knew winter before winter had a name. Helios, the all-seeing sun, was the only being who witnessed the moment the earth opened. He revealed the truth to Demeter. Hades had taken Core into his realm, and Zeus had permitted it. This betrayal fractured Olympus more deeply than any war. It placed gods against gods, necessity against morality, balance against grief. Zeus realized the world could not survive both Demeter's power and Demeter's loss. So he called upon Hermes, the only god capable of crossing thresholds. Living beings were never meant to cross. Hermes was sent to the underworld to retrieve Core, not as a warrior, not as a threat, but as a diplomat between realms. The underworld was not the inferno later cultures imagined. It was a domain of judgment, of passage, of quiet purpose. The souls drifted like mist. The rivers murmured memories. The walls glimmered with minerals, untouched by sunlight. At the centre stood the throne room. 2 thrones carved from obsidian, 2 seats of power, one occupied by Hades, and beside him, Core. Not as a captive, not as a trembling figure awaiting rescue, but as one being instructed in sovereignty. The transformation had already begun. Her posture was different. Her expression was measured. Her presence carried a weight no meadow could contain. Hermes understood the truth instantly. The maiden who entered this realm had become someone else entirely. The turning point of the myth is one of the most misunderstood. Persephone eats the pomegranate. 6 seeds. Later retellings call it a trick, a trap, a manipulation. But ancient Greek culture viewed the act differently. The pomegranate was a symbol of union, a symbol of binding paths, a symbol of accepting a role shared with another. To eat the fruit was not to be ensnared. It was to acknowledge connection. In taking the seeds, Core made a choice to be part of a realm that needed her as much as the world above had adored her. This act gave her a new name, Persephone, a name tied to cycles, a name tied to transformation, a name tied to her own autonomy. When Persephone returned to her mother, the earth erupted into life. Flowers surged from frozen ground. Rains returned. The world breathed, but the reunion carried silence beneath its joy. Persephone was no longer the maiden Demeter had raised. Her eyes held the depth of a realm untouched by sunlight. Her presence carried the echo of judgment and inevitability. Demeter recognized the truth. The daughter she lost had become a queen beyond her reach. Zeus formalized the cycle. Half the year above, half the year below, not as punishment, not as compromise, but as reflection of Persephone herself. Light and darkness interwoven in a single divine identity. Persephone returned to Olympus as 2 beings in one, the bringer of spring and the queen of the dead. Mortals experienced her presence through the seasons, through the blooming fields and the fading autumns, through the promise that death leads to rebirth. Her story became the foundation of the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most sacred rites in ancient Greece, rites that promised hope after death, renewal after loss, and meaning in the cycle of existence. Persephone became the bridge between worlds. Not a girl stolen, not a victim broken, a queen formed. The underworld had existed long before Persephone crossed its threshold. A vast realm beneath the earth, shaped by the division of the cosmos, where Hades took the domain that neither the sky nor the sea would claim. A kingdom structured with precision, the asphodel meadows for ordinary souls, the Elysian fields for those who achieved heroic distinction, Tartarus for the condemned, and the silent rivers that marked every transition from one state of being to another. This realm remained consistent, complete, unaltered, until the arrival of Persephone. Her presence marked the first significant shift the underworld would experience since the Titanomachy, not through force, not through decree, but through the simple fact that the realm had never been designed for a goddess of renewal. The underworld held the memory of all endings, but no concept of return, no archetype for rebirth, no precedent for cycles. Her footsteps added rhythm to a realm defined by stillness. Her presence aligned the underworld with a force it had never known: seasonal change. This transformation began gradually. Souls reported moments of clarity as she passed. Judges of the dead noted shifts in the choices of the newly arrived. Even Cerberus, shaped only to guard, began watching her not with hostility, but with measure. Every element of the underworld recalibrated around a figure who had never been meant to dwell there. This was the beginning of Persephone's evolution. While Demeter searched, Olympus debated. The disappearance of Persephone created tension among the gods, for any disruption to the cycle of seasons threatened both mortal survival and divine order. Zeus, positioned as the arbiter of all domains, delayed intervention. Some sources claim indecision, others describe a strategic pause. Still others point to political calculus, for Zeus had once sanctioned the abduction. This inaction revealed a truth often overlooked. Olympian unity was not a constant, but a negotiation. The crisis escalated when the earth itself began to fail. Famine spread. Mortals stopped offering harvest-based sacrifices. Temples emptied. Smoke from ritual fires thinned across the ancient world. Demeter withdrew her role entirely. As the goddess responsible for agriculture refused to restore fertility, Olympus faced a structural crisis. Without mortals, the gods lost honour, offerings, and the flow of recognition that sustained their presence. It became clear that divine hierarchy meant little in the absence of mortal survival. Only then did Zeus act. Hermes was dispatched as the negotiator between worlds, equipped with the authority to address the king of the underworld directly. But by the time Hermes crossed the gates of the realm below, Persephone was no longer simply missing. She was beginning to rule. Hermes entered the underworld and witnessed the shift already underway. Persephone stood beside Hades during the judgment of souls, not as an observer, but as a presence altering the atmosphere of the chamber. What she brought was not leniency, but clarity. Cases tangled in uncertainty found resolution. Appeals long ignored were revisited. Sentences matched intent more carefully than before. This was the moment that revealed her potential. Hades had always ruled with consistency, but Persephone introduced a dimension of equilibrium. When Hermes delivered Zeus's decree, Persephone must return to Demeter for the sake of the world. Both rulers of the underworld listened without interruption. What happened next determined the future of the cosmos. Persephone agreed to return, not out of reluctance, not from fear, but from acknowledgement of the crisis her absence had created above. The underworld would release her. but she had eaten the seeds. Whether through ritual, symbolism, choice, or the natural consequence of crossing a threshold into a realm with its own laws, the result was the same. She had become bound to the underworld by cosmic principle. The seeds were not a trap. They were a transformation. By consuming part of the realm, she aligned herself with it. This was her first irreversible act as queen. Classical sources present multiple explanations for the pomegranate seeds. Some frame the act as entrapment, others present it as an initiation. A few describe it as a moment of self-determination. The symbolism is consistent across interpretations. The fruit preserved the essence of the underworld. Consuming it connected Persephone to the domain. It established the cycle of seasonal descent and return. Scholars often compare the seeds to ancient Near Eastern descent and return myths, where deities enter the realm of the dead to establish cosmic balance. The motif parallels Inanna's descent and similar cycles involving vegetation deities. Persephone's act signified the binding of life to death, and death to life, not through marriage, not through force, but through consumption. In ancient cultures, to eat the food of a realm was to become part of it. This rule appears in multiple myth systems, indicating a shared ancient understanding of metaphysical sovereignty. Persephone became sovereign the moment she accepted the seeds. This was her contract with the underworld. Voluntary or not, the effect was decisive. She now belonged to two worlds. The compromise that followed shaped humanity's understanding of time. Persephone would spend one part of the year above with her mother. The world would flourish. Fields would yield. Mortals would sow and harvest. And she would spend the other part of the year below, in the realm where seeds rested before returning to Earth. This mirrored agricultural cycles precisely. Humanity learned to mark seasons by her journey. Her ascent aligned with spring. Her presence above sustained summer. Her descent ushered autumn. Her reign in the underworld became winter. The myth created a cosmology that explained the visible world through divine motion. Persephone became the axis of this system. Her life did not oscillate between captivity and freedom. It moved between realms of equal importance. Above, she governed growth. Below, she governed rest. Together, these formed the cycle of existence. This duality transformed her from maiden to queen. Her return to the underworld marked the start of a new era. Persephone did not return as a visitor or captive. She returned as ruler. The inhabitants of the underworld, from judges to spirits to guardians, acknowledged her role in the balance of souls. The ancient Greeks understood that the underworld required both justice and renewal. Hades embodied judgment. Persephone embodied transition. Her presence allowed the dead to move forward in their afterlife. She became the final point of passage. This role is often overlooked in modern retellings, but in classical sources Persephone adjudicates. She enforces boundaries. She oversees oaths. She punishes those who defy sacred law, as in the myths of Sisyphus or those who violated the natural order. Her authority was distinct from Hades's. Where he governed the structure of the realm, she governed its movement. She was the threshold itself. Persephone's story represents one of the most complex archetypes of Greek mythology. She is neither passive nor singular. Her dual identity, Kore the maiden and Persephone the queen, reflects life and death, spring and winter, innocence and sovereignty, emergence and descent, renewal and finality. These pairs are not contradictions. They are functions of the same cycle. Ancient Greeks understood that no growth could occur without dormancy, no return without descent, no regeneration without the space to rest. Persephone personified this cosmology. She did not symbolize death alone. She symbolized the continuity between states. Her myth became a philosophical model for change. The influence of her myth extended beyond narrative. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most sacred rites of ancient Greece, centered on Persephone's descent and return. These rites promised initiates a deeper understanding of life, death, and what lay beyond. The ceremonies were restricted. Their full content remains unknown, but the themes were documented. Descent into darkness, transformation, return in renewed form. Initiates believed that Persephone's journey offered a blueprint for the human soul. Her story became the spiritual foundation for the concept of afterlife continuity. No other Greek goddess held this position. She was not simply a character in myth. She was the key to a religious system that lasted for centuries. In later myths, Persephone's authority expands. She becomes associated with enforcing sacred laws, such as the Oath of the Styx. She delivers judgment equal to that of the underworld's rulers. She remains incorruptible in her duties. She commands respect from both gods and mortals. Notably, Persephone is one of the few deities whom even Zeus avoids provoking. She represents finality. An oath sworn by her carried weight beyond divine hierarchy. This places her in a position on par with the primordial forces. She became not only a queen, but a guardian of cosmic order. Her crown did not arise from marriage alone. It arose from the transformation she embodied. Each time Persephone resurfaced, the earth shifted dramatically. The ground thawed, seeds stirred, plants emerged after months of rest. Mortals recognized the pattern and built seasonal calendars around it. But the myth also preserved another truth. Persephone never returned as core again. Even in the world above, her presence carried the authority of the underworld. She walked among the living with the knowledge of those who had crossed the boundary between life and death. Mortals worshipped her not only as a symbol of spring, but as a goddess who held dominion over the fate of every soul. Her duality remained constant. This duality defined her worship. It defined the cycle of seasons. It defined the Greek worldview. The ancient Greeks did not portray Persephone's story as a tragedy. It was a cosmological explanation, a cycle that maintained order in both worlds. Her myth preserved balance between mother and daughter, god of death and goddess of life, mortal needs and divine governance, surface and depths, beginning and ending. This balance held because Persephone existed in both realms without fully belonging to either. She became the hinge on which the cosmos turned. The return of Persephone to the surface brought resolution not through reversion, but through realignment. Demeter regained her daughter, and the land revived in accordance with ancient cosmic law. The fields responded immediately. Grain rose from the soil. Orchards restored themselves. Humanity resumed offerings, anchoring the relationship between mortals and gods once more. But the world had changed, because Persephone had changed. Her time in the underworld was not erased upon her ascent. Her authority persisted. Her sovereignty remained intact. She had become more than a goddess returning home. She had become the embodiment of a newly established equilibrium. Zeus recognized the permanence of this change. Hades recognized the inevitability of it. Demeter confronted the truth of it. The world witnessed the effects of it. The Olympian order now included a dual sovereign goddess, whose power extended across domains. Persephone no longer occupied a single realm. She occupied the passage between realms. The reunion between Demeter and Persephone, a cornerstone of the ancient seasonal myth, carried a subtle shift in its presentation. Demeter saw her daughter return not as Kore, the sheltered maiden, but as Persephone, queen of the realm that even the gods approached with caution. The bond between mother and daughter did not dissolve, but it reformed along new boundaries. Demeter could no longer claim absolute guardianship. Persephone could no longer exist only in the world of growth. Each held a domain essential to the continuity of existence. Their roles now reflected the duality necessary for the agricultural cycles that defined Greek civilization. The myth's resolution was not the restoration of the old world, it was the establishment of a new one. Across Greek literature and cult practice, Persephone emerges in three principal forms. Each represents a phase of her development and a layer of her sovereignty. 1. Kore, the maiden of spring. Associated with renewal, emergence, and the surface world, her presence above sustains fertility and growth. 2. The Queen, ruler of the underworld. A sovereign equal to Hades. Her authority governs the movement of souls, the sanctity of oaths, and the balance of endings. 3. The Mediator, bridge between realms. The rare figure who exists in both worlds without losing her identity in either. This aspect anchors the myth's philosophical core. These three forms are not separate beings. They are the composite identity that forms the complete Persephone. This triadic structure appears in ritual iconography, in Homeric hymns, and within the Eleusinian Mysteries. It represents the full arc of transformation from innocence to sovereignty. The myth's payoff lies in the revelation that Persephone did not lose herself in the underworld. She expanded. Unlike certain Olympian deities whose power could be contested, Persephone's authority was absolute once established. No myth records her dethronement. No myth describes her challenged. No myth depicts her replaced. The underworld, unlike the sky or sea, was not a realm of revolutions. It was a realm built on stability, law, and inevitability. Persephone's sovereignty contributed to that stability. Her rule was embedded into the cosmic structure, reinforced through seasonal cycles, ritual practices, and the metaphysical logic that governed death and rebirth. The permanence of her authority stands in contrast to the shifting allegiances and conflicts of Olympus. In a pantheon known for upheaval, hers was a throne secured by mythology, ritual, and natural law. Persephone's transformation into a queen did not merely grant her a title, it granted her jurisdiction. Her rulings carried weight across all realms. Her presence legitimized transitions. Her authority shaped both mortal and divine boundaries. This made her one of the few deities whose power extended beyond specific functions or domains. She governed the threshold itself. Mortals feared death, but they respected the force that moderated it. Their rites acknowledged her as the figure who ensured that death did not become chaos. From a mythological standpoint, Persephone guaranteed continuity. Without her, the cycle of seasons would collapse, agriculture would fail, souls would stagnate, the Eleusinian Mysteries would lose their foundation. Mortals would have no spiritual model for renewal. Her presence maintained equilibrium across the entire cosmology. Classical interpretations of the myth often place emphasis on the abduction, the grief, or the famine. But the true pivot occurs not in these events, but in the moment Persephone returns to the surface as a queen. Her narrative does not frame her as a victim reclaimed. It frames her as a sovereign whose identity now spans two worlds. This is the revelation embedded in the myth structure. She does not simply go back. She arrives bearing authority. Her presence is transformative, not because it restores what was lost, but because it introduces what had never existed before. A goddess capable of mediating between the living and the dead through recurring cycles. This role becomes the foundation of her legacy. The underworld, prior to Persephone, functioned with strict delineations and immutable structures. With Persephone's rule, new frameworks of passage emerged. She became associated with transitions of the newly deceased, guidance of souls seeking judgment, the potential for purification, the symbolic promise of eventual return during her ascents. This did not create literal resurrection in Greek thought, but it did create a metaphorical continuity between mortality and the cycles of the natural world. Her role echoed early agrarian beliefs in the sowing and rising of crops. Mortality mirrored agriculture. Persephone functioned as the mythic embodiment of that truth. In the Eleusinian Mysteries, Persephone's descent and return formed the core of a doctrine that shaped Greek concepts of afterlife. Initiates believed life followed cycles of transformation. Death was not dissolution. The soul could move through stages. Persephone governed the unseen path. The mysteries offered insight into this journey. These rites endured for nearly 2 millennia, demonstrating Persephone's significance, not merely as a mythic figure, but as a foundational religious archetype. Her story became the bridge between human experience and divine structure. The payoff of the myth lies in this profound reinterpretation of death. Persephone did not eliminate mortality. She contextualized it. Persephone represents one of the earliest mythological depictions of a figure who exists simultaneously in opposing realms without contradiction. She is both spring and winter, both life and death, both emergence and descent, both innocence and sovereignty. Her myth challenges the assumption that transformation requires erasure. Instead, it presents transformation as accumulation. She remains core, she becomes Persephone. Both identities coexist. This duality grants her a scope of influence unrivaled among the Olympians. The world depends on her movements. The underworld depends on her presence. Mortals depend on her cycles. The gods depend on the continuity her myth guarantees. This is the structural revelation. Persephone is not defined by what happened to her. She is defined by the world that formed around her. The conflict between Demeter, Hades, and Zeus resolves not through victory, but through balance. Demeter retains her daughter for a portion of the year, ensuring the survival of mortals. Hades retains his queen, ensuring the stability of the underworld. Zeus preserves the cosmic order without diminishing the power of any party. The myth does not declare a winner. It establishes the equilibrium that defines reality. This equilibrium is not fragile, it is self-sustaining. It cycles endlessly. It forms the foundation for the passage of seasons, the structure of agriculture, and the spiritual worldview of the ancient Greeks. Persephone is the axis around which this equilibrium turns. Through the full arc of her myth, Persephone becomes one of the most significant deities in Greek mythology. She anchors the agricultural system, the afterlife system, the religious mysteries, the seasonal cycle, the spiritual concept of renewal. Her narrative carries implications that extend beyond myth into the philosophical and ritualistic foundations of Greek society. She transforms the cosmos by embodying its transitions. Her power does not diminish. Her sovereignty does not fracture. Her authority does not waver. Persephone becomes a permanent fixture of universal rhythm. Persephone's myth endures not because it is dramatic, nor because it is ancient, but because it defines one of the oldest human truths. Everything ends, everything returns, everything begins again. Civilizations rise and fall, empires collapse into dust, gods fade from worship, but the cycle she governs remains unchanged. The return of spring, the decay of winter, the passing of generations, the continuity of memory. Persephone became a symbol embedded not only in religion but in the agricultural and philosophical frameworks of the ancient world. Her myth survived because it aligned with reality itself. As Greek culture expanded, Persephone's significance evolved beyond the foundational myth. She became the central figure of the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most influential religious rites in the ancient Mediterranean. Initiates travelled from across the Greek world to enter the sanctuary at Eleusis. They came seeking answers that traditional religion could not provide. They entered darkness, symbolic of descent. They witnessed sacred representations of the myth, symbolic of transition. They emerged into torchlight, symbolic of renewal. The initiate's journey mirrored Persephone's. The mysteries promised not immortality, but understanding. Not escape from death, but clarity in its purpose. Not certainty, but acceptance. For nearly 2,000 years, the Eleusinian Mysteries remained the spiritual heart of Greece. Persephone stood at the centre of that heartbeat. In later philosophical thought, Persephone's authority extended beyond seasonal change and agricultural cycles. She became associated with the moral architecture of the underworld. Not punishment, not torment, but order. Classical writers describe her as a guardian of oaths, a witness to truths hidden from the living, and a judge whose rulings carried impartial weight. Where Hades represented the inevitability of death, Persephone represented the integrity of the system that followed. Her justice was calm, consistent, and incorruptible. Mortals invoked her name in oaths because even the gods respected her domain. Persephone became the arbiter of what could and could not be concealed. Early Greek art depicted Kore, youthful, bright, the embodiment of spring. Later art depicted Persephone, poised, regal, bearing symbols of sovereignty. Her posture changed, her expression changed, her surroundings changed. The transformation reflected her narrative. She was no longer merely a daughter of Demeter, no longer solely a maiden of meadows, no longer a figure defined by disappearance or return. She became the queen of the underworld in full representation. Artists portrayed her seated beside Hades, equal in scale, equal in authority. In some scenes, she precedes the king himself. This inversion indicates a profound shift in her narrative position. Persephone was not an accessory to a throne. She was an essential half of its power. No other Greek deity commands such a wide metaphysical range. Persephone governs. The sprouting of seeds, the decay of the old year, the passage of souls, the purity of oaths, the structure of the afterlife, the continuity of the cosmos, the return of life after winter. Her myth is not merely a story of abduction, grief, or compromise. It is a story of ascension. Her power grew because the world required it. Her sovereignty emerged because the cosmos depended on it. Persephone stands at the most critical junction in Greek mythology, the bridge between life and death. This duality granted her a level of influence beyond that of most Olympians. Every mortal who lived in the ancient world experienced the effects of Persephone's myth directly. When she returned to the surface, life resumed. When she descended, the earth rested. When her story was reenacted in ritual, communities found hope. When her cycles repeated, generations found continuity. Her myth shaped, planting seasons, harvest rituals, mourning customs, weddings and transitions, agricultural calendars, philosophical interpretations of change. Persephone became the hinge around which mortal existence turned. Her story provided explanation. Her return provided reassurance. Her descent provided meaning. Classical philosophers examined Persephone's dual existence to explore deeper questions. Plato referenced her in discussions of life cycles. Pindar linked her to purification of the soul. Stoic thinkers used her descent and return as metaphors for endurance and renewal. The myth served as a symbolic framework for discussing transformation, suffering, change, growth, the nature of the soul, the necessity of endings, the value of beginnings. Persephone's story became a philosophical lens. Her existence proved that duality does not imply contradiction. It implies completeness. As Greek influence spread, Persephone's identity transformed again. The Romans called her Proserpina. Her narrative remained mostly intact, but Roman interpretations emphasized her sovereignty more than her innocence. In mystery cults of the later empire, she remained a central figure. In medieval allegory, she represented the cycle of the human soul. In Renaissance literature, she represented the paradox of change. In modern retellings, she often appears as an emblem of transformation, autonomy and resilience. The core remains unchanged. Persephone defines transition. Mythic resolution does not follow the structure of a modern story. There is no final scene, no singular ending, no definitive conclusion. Instead, Persephone's myth resolves through repetition. Every year she descends. Every year she returns. Every year the world witnesses the impact of her movement. The payoff lies in understanding that her story does not end because her role does not end. Her myth resolves not through closure, but through continuity. She becomes the living embodiment of the world's oldest cycle. Across thousands of years, the myth has endured because it mirrors human experience. No one remains in a single state. No identity is fixed. No life stays suspended in one phase. Persephone represents the shift, the moment of transition that defines every existence. She is the goddess of emergence and descent, of loss and return, of innocence and power, of light and shadow. This dual nature makes her one of the most compelling figures in all mythology. Her story resonates not because it offers comfort, but because it reflects truth. Everything changes, everything cycles, everything transforms. Persephone is the mythic embodiment of that universal fact. Persephone stands at the threshold between worlds. Flowers bloom at her feet, shadows gather at her back. The earth responds to her presence. The underworld listens for her return. She holds the keys to a realm no other god fully understands. She carries the memory of a world that depends on her movement. She wears the crown not as a symbol of captivity, but of ascension. Her reign is cyclical. Her power is perpetual. Her story is foundational. Persephone remains the queen who governs the boundary between existence and its inevitable transformation. The story of Persephone is not a tale of abduction or loss. It is the chronicle of a goddess who rose to rule the most formidable realm in the cosmos, and in doing so, reshaped the natural order itself. Her descent carved the structure of winter. Her return breathed life into spring. Her duality gave meaning to the cycles upon which all existence depends. If myths reveal the truths ancient cultures could not express through history, then Persephone represents one of the deepest truths of all. Every ending is a beginning waiting to return. If this journey through the underworld and back brought clarity, to a goddess often misunderstood, then continue the descent through the ancient world. Subscribe, explore the archive, and return for the next myth, because the stories of the gods are never still. They move, they shift, they return, just like Persephone.